Hello, everyone. I just want to say you guys are certainly in for a treat. I'm excited for this. I'm going to preface the presentations with a few little ground rules. We're going to start off with the 4 presentations. Going to try to keep them between 5 and 7.5 minutes. And we will refrain from asking questions until the discussion period afterwards. And we'll get right into it with Dr. Bello.
Excellent. Thank you. Wonderful to see everyone. Thank you for coming. So I will start off trying to situate this phenomenon of information battlefield in the larger international security and conflict landscape. And after that, I will give you a bit of science around disinformation. And since we're talking about Russia, I'll also be talking about societal subversion as a science, which was actually developed in the mid-20th century. Slide, please. Slide. Thank you. So to begin with, there has been an evolution in terms of international conflicts. We moved from these rather rudimentary formations on the battlefield to a rather complex environment where we have information as one of the many formats of international conflicts from which we have different security concerns emerging, and we will be talking about many of them as the panel proceeds. Generally, why do we have this evolution? Well, there are a number of components to this, first of which the cost of war is enormous in the sense that human cost and material cost and infrastructure costs. So in order to achieve geopolitical outcomes, we have to find alternative means of fighting. That is in the gray zone. Information being one of the ways by which we fight. Considering these 3 components, we now see the general global security architecture largely being impacted by this gray zone conflict environment. In other words, what we're seeing today, for example, in Ukraine is actually an anomaly. Most fighting happens in the gray zone between the state of absolute peace and absolute war, so total war. So how do we manage this environment in terms of information space? Let's continue. Very briefly, in terms of gray zone conflict format characteristics, it's the dominant format of international relations today, especially when we're talking about international security. And there are a number of reasons why we've seen the emergence of this conflict format as the dominant one. One is technological innovation. The second, permeability of international borders, unlike we've ever seen throughout history before. International law, creating permissive conditions. And finally, the involvement of non-state entities, so non-countries acting in this international security space at an increasing rate. Slide, please. Interesting, and this is something we can develop in our Q&A, gray zone conflict is actually a whole of society phenomenon. In other words, it's not like during the Cold War when we had the traditional militaries being the main tool of deterrence and the main security threat. Now we have an entire apparatus of different factors that are contributing to international security. And these aspects we have to mitigate as a society, therefore. And to make things even more complex, a lot of these geopolitical outcomes that we're trying to achieve, they happen incrementally. And therefore, our deterrence has to be responsive to this incremental and gradual evolution of gray zone conflicts and associated security threats. So, in terms of the gray zone battlefield, among other spaces, it also takes place in the information space. So, this being a deliberate space where the battlefield happens, why do countries and non-state actors choose to engage in this? Well, there are 3 main reasons. One is disruption. In other words, disrupting the adversary in terms of communication, in terms of information, the ability to coordinate governance structures. Mobilization. So if we have, for example, a separatist conflict somewhere, then we can infuse information that will try to get people more and more involved in anti-government activity, or just upsetting the local political landscape in general. Slide. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because information warfare as part of political warfare is actually a science. And since we're talking about Russia, and again, gray zone conflict is not just something that's attributable to Russia's actions. We all countries in the world engage in it in some capacity, but we're just talking about Russia. So in Russia, this was actually developed by what used to be called the First Chief Directorate of the Committee of State Security, or the KGB. And we know about this science of subversion from an interesting interview by Yuri Bezmenov, who was a defector to Canada, actually. And he gave an interview in 1985 about how he was trained in subversion, being a pseudo-journalist. So there are 4 stages. And again, it's very difficult to understand how achievable these are or what the history of success has been. Demoralization, which is the first stage of the 4, where we see a moral fiber degradation, manipulation of information space, towards the second stage, which is destabilizing, trying to create a broken promises sort of narrative. The government promised you something and they didn't deliver, which should erode trust and create this idea that there has to be something that's going to be done about this. Then this will escalate to the level of crisis, or creation of what many have called political earthquake, a general panic. Finally, there's a normalization that should occur after this, where a new, more favorable political equilibrium will be reached. In other words, those who infuse the crisis and the subversion operations, the outcome should be then favorable to them. So this is the science. The question becomes, how do we deter against this rather scientific approach? Well, there are 3 options. We can censor media space, because this is where a lot of that subversion actually occurs. We can make borders less permeable. In other words, turn our information space into a more isolationist one. Or we can ignore the threats if we don't think that they warrant a lot of these measures. And I will leave you with the question, if we do choose to deter, how do we do this in such a way that we can balance our security concerns and our democratic institutions and the values we created through our constitutional regime? If we had a perfect answer to this, our life would look quite differently, but this is a balancing act that our policymaking community does every single day. So, thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'd like me to introduce Dr. Curtis. Let me get your slides up.
First, disinformation has been around for a long time. Its evil stepsisters are propaganda and fake news. So when we're talking about what's going on in the world today, we really want to be talking about disinformation, propaganda, and fake news. Now, propaganda is the oldest of the 3. It's been around forever. Most of you, if you think about propaganda, probably the first thing you think about, the best example of propaganda, if it's not working on it. There we go. Is the Nazis, right? In the 1930s, they really perfected propaganda and really changed the world and became the most threatening government in the history of the world. Fake news, on the other hand, is fairly new. Actually, though, it does go back to the Red Scare and what we used to call the yellow journalism about 100 years ago. And then it kind of morphed into about 25 years ago when a guy on Comedy Central, who we all know, started a television show and started a thing called fake news. And there's an organization or a newspaper called The Onion. And that became fake news, which was intentionally funny and fake. And that's what we call fake news until 2016. At a news conference, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, was giving a news conference. The CNN reporter asked him some questions. He didn't like the questions. And he says, I'm not going to answer you because you are fake news. And therefore, fake news morphed into its new definition, which is essentially any news, real or unreal, that I don't like. That's fake news. And all 3 of them together are extraordinarily powerful. So this is what most of our panel is going to be talking about, is this area here from these, this bubble here on this Venn diagram, which is the information manipulation that Russia primarily has perfected. But Dani mentioned earlier, China, Iran, North Korea, ISIS, it goes on and on and on, and they all do it every day. The fires in Hawaii, China has been using disinformation against the United States across the world to benchmarking off of the fires in Hawaii about our government and how we manage crisis. So in my area, really what we're focusing on is the message delivery. How do we get all this stuff that my colleagues are going to talk about to you so that you can absorb it and figure out what to do with it in the way they want you to do it? So that primarily occurs, the message delivery format is through social media. Social media is what every single one of you have in your pocket right this moment. You open it up, and I bet everybody in the room, less than 30, was on TikTok at least once today. Or if you're over 50, you were on Facebook. Okay? And so social media is the means with which we get our data. 82% of people in America today get most of their news from social media, not from news sources. So you get a blend of what's just put out there based on an algorithm that is pushed to you based upon your reading habits. So the social media, the development of the social networks is how we get information to you, and it goes to a specific group of people. True believers, an example would be MAGA Nation, true believers. Bots, you all have heard of bots, which are the robots that push it out, which magnifies the message hundreds of thousands of times for everything that comes out. It's what makes things trending. And then useful idiots. Useful idiots is a Russian term that is used for people who honestly don't know what they're talking about and become a conveyance or a mode to get the information out. These are often the people who say, well, I'm going to do my own research. Okay. When you hear that, get scared. All of that then is done by digital social engineering. You notice the digital social engineering. Social engineering has been around since mankind. Social engineering is what we all do in our lives every day. When we try to manipulate our significant other, our parents, our best buddies to go to a movie, and when they don't want to go, we're going to use different ways to social engineer people. The oldest example of social engineering that I can think of comes from Genesis in the Bible, when Jacob social engineered his brother Esau and his father Isaac to get his birthright, so that he then became the father of the nations of the world, of the Jewish tribes. I guess you could technically say that when the snake, the serpent, manipulated Eve, that was social engineering, but that wasn't a human being, that was a deity. So, but the first example would be Jacob. So when you look at what we're talking about here, you merge in digital social engineering, which is what we're doing online every day through manipulation of human beings, lies, propaganda, fake news, continuous bombardment with bots, amplifying the message. You don't know what's real. You don't know what's not real. You don't know what's true. You don't know what alternative truths are. And you get all of that thrown at you through social media, through the many, many, many ways that all of us get our news every day. And then the messaging that is used is through one of these three areas. Combine that, and you have the kind of weapon that he talked about. In the national security arena, which is where I come from, we believe that this is the most threatening weapon that can be used against a democracy. Think about that.
For the sake of time,
I'm done. All right. So just think about that. More threatening than a kinetic weapon is information warfare.
thank you so much.
So my presentation's on Russian disinformation campaign, heightening racial tensions in the US. So as Professor Bello alluded beforehand, Russia in its disinformation campaign utilizes a contemporary form of information warfare, an attempt for subversion tactics, as he described prior, as active measures. So I'll be explaining it in the context of the 2016 elections, following up from before the elections and then after elections. So I'll be describing how it targeted disproportionately topics of race and the Black community in the US. So what is the IRA and what did they do? So the IRA is the Internet Research Agency, a Russian company that has close affiliation with the Russian government. The IRA utilizes racial tensions in the US by executing a multidimensional misinformation operation in modern information spaces such as social media. So the IRA utilized racial tensions in the US by executing the active measures in different aspects of social media such as Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So the first step of active measures, as Professor Bello explained, is demoralization. So we see that as like the breaking down of the moral fibers, values, and integrity of people's trust within their country, particularly in information spaces. So we see that on like Facebook, Instagram, and these platforms, we saw like fake disguised Black activists and pages being presented. So pages such as Blackstagram, Sincerely Black, and even real individuals' names were used for this campaign. Posts range from showcasing Black excellence to showcasing protests that were happening due to the Black Lives Matter movement that was happening in 2013 to 15, following suit in 16. And then we also saw videos and displaying of police brutality and being pushed out exorbitantly due to this chance of demoralization of society. So the next step is destabilization. So that's creating the rift between our government and the citizens of this nation. In the case of the IRA, it wasn't like they were seeding doubt or creating this rift themselves, but it was already created due to the addressing and solving the racialized systematic racism that's already in our system and our historic history of the US. But due to the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and already existing rifts, so it kind of created this strength within the Black community and finally internalized like solidarity, but also you can see that there is a distance of interest for trusting political systems, particularly ones that have failed them previously. And so then you see this case of crisis. And so as I mentioned prior, so in 2013 to 15, cases of police brutality were posted online, where it was Trayvon Martin's death, as well as Michael Brown in St. Louis. And we see there's specific like cases of the protests that have caused these disinformation campaigns to be able to have a tool to grab onto to disseminate this information further, because this crisis already was instilled in our society at this time and just kind of inflated it due to these images of police brutality. And so there are specific cases where you see these pages utilizing this fear and distrust in our society. So the next step is was a case that I gotta take a breath, sorry. Where a case was that a social media page called Black Fist was funding these Black activists hosting events for self-defense. They provided self-defense classes for people in low-income communities, and in its initial like conception isn't necessarily bad and actually quite helpful. But again, as I explained, it creates this area for fear and this, as it states as a crisis, that there will be an internal battle within our state eventually. So it's kind of prepping people for that crisis to ensue. And then you see a normalization, which is the shift of political equilibrium, which we haven't seen such yet because it is such a drastic form of active measures, and we don't see that happening sometime soon. But during the 2016 election, you can see that there was a drop in Black voting, which was kind of their initial goal. So we see that Black votes went down from 66% in 2012 to 59% in 2016. So we do kind of see the shift in trust in electoral processes.
And just for the sake of time, I'll give you about 30 more seconds.
All good. So then the next slide is our steps to stop these trolls. First, I believe that there should be an acknowledgement that ethnic and racial discrimination can be utilized in the information space, as well as there's proper measures to take down these accounts, but they're very difficult because it's hard to tell between if this is a real page with someone's opinions, or is it Russian propaganda, as Professor Gorga will test you guys on soon enough. And we don't want to create democratic backsliding where people's freedom of speech and freedom of press is infringed. Thank you guys so much.
All right. So I'm a sociologist and a criminologist. So my interest is really in how does the IRA activity online translate into real world behavior? So what's that connection? And there's really limited research on this. There's a lot of great research describing what the bots are doing and what they're saying, not as much information on the connection between online exposure to real world behavior. And part of that is just that that's a really difficult thing to measure. And then add on top of that, if we're interested in something like hate crimes, those are an especially rare type of crime compared to other types of crime. So establishing like a statistical connection is a challenge. We do know that social behavior can be affected by exposure to content online in other domains, but whether the bots specifically had some kind of role in that, I think the jury's kind of out. I'm going to go through a little bit of what we know. The majority of the trolls in the 2016 IRA campaign were conservative trolls. I'll call those far-right trolls. And I will say that people on the far-right end of the spectrum appear to be more likely to be persuaded by disinformation than people on the far left. However, people on far extremes of both ends are more likely to be persuaded by disinformation than those in the middle. The trolls posted patriotic, anti-immigrant, pro-gun, pro-veteran, pro-police imagery, and a lot of them were trying to elicit anger at liberal appeasement to groups that might have been identified as others at the expense of white US citizens, but also police and veterans. In the field of extremist violence, we call this a crisis narrative. So this is essentially a narrative that combines real and imagined conflicts in order to motivate people to engage in extremist violence or other extremist action. So a classic example would be in Nazi Germany. Nazis and Hitler argued that the Jewish people were puppeteers behind World War I that sabotaged German efforts, that were trying to sabotage, German identity. And so if that is true, then that would justify some kind of extreme response against those instigators. In the case of the far-right IRA posts, as you can see from these examples, the outgroup is mainly liberals who are doing that liberal appeasement, but also Muslims, immigrants, Mexicans, and inner-city African Americans. And they are framed as being responsible for creating an existential threat to the mainly white US citizens, which are the in-group, but especially Southerns for some reason. That was like another common tactic. The bots were often Southerners. Whether exposure to a crisis narrative translates into violence is a little messy. We know that in order to engage in extremist violence, you do have to buy into a crisis narrative. And it's plausible to assume that the bots increased the number of people who bought into crisis narratives, but there isn't any research that actually tries to answer that question. So yeah, there are lots of unanswered questions. So there hasn't been research that has attempted to answer that. And also lots of people buy into crisis narratives that never go on to commit violence. A lot of people thought that the election was stolen in 2020. Most of those people did not get on a plane, go to DC. And then among that subgroup, many did not go into the Capitol and inflict violence. So that prediction is difficult to establish. There is a lot of evidence that when political elites share crisis narratives like these, that hate crimes do go up. Doesn't seem to be the case that when bots share them, crimes go up, but the bots can have an effect in other ways. They can amplify, they can do false amplification by following or retweeting elites sharing crisis narratives, but again, not a lot of research to answer that specific question. You might be curious about whether or not it had an effect on the 2016 election. Naima gave a little bit of a glimpse into that. Again, the jury's kind of out. There was a really good study published in Nature by Gregory Eady that concluded that it did not affect political attitudes, political polarization, or voting patterns. So they looked at Twitter users from April 2016, and then they surveyed them again in October 2016, and then followed up on their voting patterns, and they did not find that relationship. I do want to point out that that is Twitter data, and it seems like maybe the Facebook campaigns might have been more effective. The Most Twitter bots did not receive any kind of engagement from real, authentic Twitter users. So hard to say, I wouldn't rule that out, but I will also point out that 1% of authentic Twitter users accounted for 70% of IRA bot engagement. And most of those authentic Twitter users were highly partisan Republicans. So people that are probably not going to vote for Hillary Clinton under any circumstance. So if it affected the outcome, I mean, if it didn't affect the outcome, that's probably why.
And just for the sake of time, I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds.
Shoot. Okay, sorry, I rambled too long.
You're all right.
There's a couple of other studies that show that market odds favoring Republicans in 2016 election betting markets hit their low point on Russian holidays when those trolls were less active. And then there was another study on African-American bots, which is the second most likely type of bot behind far-right bots. They found that IRA ads in 2018 about police brutality were correlated with Black Lives Matter protests. It's a correlation, not a causation. There could be some third variable, but I'll end it there for you.